Many times in society, you hear people say they can't make a difference. We're going to tell you a story that's very exciting because it's about 400 people who did make a difference, who gave us what became the greatest country in the world. I'm Vaughn Baker. I've spoken to you before for PAC 14, and with me tonight is Bruce Spicer. Bruce?
Thank you, Vaughn. And you know, Vaughn, when you first told me about this, I was really amazed at how such a group of people, 400 soldiers from Maryland, some from Delaware, actually impacted the Revolutionary War, saved George Washington's army, and allowed this country to be born. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be here talking about it. I was very amazed. I'm excited to be sharing this with you.
Well, Bruce, I don't think many people realize the importance that the United States has. Very few people in the history of mankind has enjoyed the kind of freedoms that we have. And we all know about the founding, but when you realize that it's Marylanders who actually allowed to save the day, it's very exciting.
When you think about it, when all of history and everything, it's just a very small sliver of history that we represent.
Exactly.
So we're very privileged to live in this country.
And it was not only the Maryland militia that we discovered. We discovered that the Delaware militia here on the Eastern Shore were combined together to be one unit after a while. Their losses were so great, Bruce. So many of these Marylanders and so many of these Delaware soldiers died that they formed one unit. And they were in every battle throughout the campaign with for General Washington.
You know, Vaughn, the unique geographical aspect of the peninsula allowed these men from Delaware and Maryland to form a group together and fight very good together, very well. They got along very well, and they had a lot of the same ideals.
And before some of those listeners out there start nodding off because this is history, let me tell you that the Statue of Liberty looks at the battlefield where these Marylanders fell. So pay attention, folks.
And you know, the Statue of Liberty came along 100 years after the battle. And that's when France gave it to us, and they thought it was so important back then that they were still thinking about that battle.
Before we talk to the folks tonight and explain the Maryland 400, we really have to move back 20 years in time to the French Indian War. And there were a lot of Marylanders and Virginians fighting with the British against the French and Indian out on the Pennsylvania area. And one of these interesting stories is Thomas Fassett, a fellow from Sinnapuxet. He and his brother were part of this militia, and they were not in formation. They were firing these rifles. They actually had rifles, and they were firing these rifles from behind trees at the French soldiers. And suddenly Braddock, the top British general, wanted them to form a European formation. He kept calling them militia. These guys were in buckskins, and they were not the disciplined soldiers that he was expecting. And as the story goes, if you go over to NAB and read some of the family records, you discover that Braddock takes a saber and he goes up and he kills John Fassett to make a point to the rest of the militia that they need to follow his orders. And some of them staggered out, I suppose, but shortly thereafter, Braddock fell out of the saddle, the leading British soldier. But he wasn't shot from the front, he was shot from the back, and it was a rifle shot, and Thomas Fassett is supposedly the fellow that did this. And the Americans were really distressed. How were they going to tell the British why their top general was shot in the back? And Fassett was sort of retired back to the Eastern Shore and lived a longer life. But I think it's these techniques that we see formed out there that's so important, not only here, actually at Lexington and Concord. I think you were reading about that.
I think one of the things that really struck me was the fact of the arrogance of the British, so to speak. They wanted to form the colonials into their method of fighting that they were using in Europe and everything, where they were just getting them to march into battle in lines and everything, and it shows the independent streak of these colonists because they wanted to adapt their own method, and they didn't see the common sense in the other method, so to speak. And you know, that theme kind of plays throughout the whole history, even the Revolutionary War, that the British, especially back in England and everything, were looking down on the colonists.
And these same fellas, or let's fast forward 20 years, we were talking about it yesterday. We fast forward 20 years and we right up to Lexington and Concord, and most folks have heard about the shot that was heard around the world. Well, you might want to talk about how it was some of these same people from Western Maryland who walked all the way there.
Yeah, and you know, the militia from the Western Maryland and everything, they marched over hundreds of miles to get up there into Massachusetts, and it took them quite a while. On the way up, in order to make money and support themselves and everything, they put on shooting matches, and these fellows were very accurate and everything. I mean, they actually took a 7-inch plate, put it between their knees, and at a 200-yard space, they were actually able to hit that plate.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd be brave enough to do that or not, but
that's a good way to thin your ranks of people that you're not particularly fond of.
And also to build trust among each other.
John Gumby, right here from the Eastern Shore, was a volunteer right there. He wasn't part of the group you're talking about that came from Western Maryland. John Gumby had volunteered his services. He was so fired up about what was happening in this country, and he was at the shot that was heard around the world, and stood with them as other volunteers did.
And I think it's very interesting as to what his father told him when he got back.
Yeah, John Gumby comes back and he's telling his father, and his father's saying, "Oh, John, I don't want you to do that. I mean, there's a place for you if you work with them and
Yeah,
John,
don't be disloyal.
Yeah. And what did Gumby say?
Well, he'd rather have one foot in the grave than to live under the British rule.
Right. So, Bruce, that brings us up to July the 4th. July the 4th.
Oh,
But
yes.
1776 was the first one. And the Declaration of Independence, and we all know that. What few of us realize is that you had a whole country of redcoats saying, "Who do those people think they are? Why, those no good, ungrateful thugs over there. I mean, we've been helping them.
That's right.
We've been giving them taxes, and they've been complaining about it. I mean, what are they complaining about?"
That's right.
So every one of the signers was a traitor in the eyes of the British.
And if they'd been caught, they'd been hung.
That's correct.
They put their fortunes and their life right on the line when they signed that document.
Yeah. Thank them, because this small sliver of civilization over the eons, we've had such a wonderful life. And the British were so upset that other than D-Day, there was never an armada as large, the one that was formed. They decided, the British, to come over and just intimidate the living heck out of us. And they brought 10,000 sailors. I've never got a good, accurate count on the ships, but it was over 400. And 20,000 of the best soldiers in the world.
Right.
And it happened at the time that Washington was forming his little army right in what we know as New York City. It was a village of 20,000 people. And he brought these huge ships and all of these soldiers, and out of shot range, had these soldiers parade around just to intimidate them, because they wanted to get the war over right away.
They had 4,000 homes that were built in Manhattan, and they were mostly built out of wood. So they were concerned when they started seeing these man of war and all their guns and stuff and the ships coming in. They were arriving in about 3 ships a day. And I think the British were just trying to have a show of strength. First of all, they located on Staten Island, and then they would go up and down the Hudson with their ships. And then they'd have these shooting matches over there and so forth on the island there. And I think they were just trying to intimidate.
Bruce, in fact, they had a couple of huge warships with 64 guns. That meant 32 on each side.
Right.
And they would actually cruise. They could not get up the East River because of the winds, prevailing winds right then. But they'd go up the Hudson, and they would just fire 32 guns. Boom, 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 on this small little village. Turn, come back, and throw 32 guns. Imagine, just the debris, the utter slaughter going on at that given time. It's unbelievable. Right. Yet they didn't cave. And these are farm boys. I remember reading in the NAB Center about some of these fellows before they got up to this battle. They went and settled their account at the store, and they were buying ribbons so they could put ribbons on their uniform so they could identify them from the Delaware group, from the militia from Rhode Island, so they could identify themselves.
And you know, Vaughn, if we look at it from the British point of view, they had this empire all over the world. They couldn't risk just letting these little rebels succeed. So that was their goal when they came over here with all these ships and all these men and everything. They wanted to crush them right away. And they thought that they would actually collapse just from the size of the fleet and the men. And that was their attitude towards the whole thing. The arrogance of it, really. That they weren't even willing to listen to anything that the colonists had to say. They just wanted to put this thing down and get home.
So you would think, Bruce, that these fellows would have been intimidated by this, but they held the ground.
Yeah, why is that?
Well, you know, I don't know. We weren't there. So, but I believe we had 3 generations of, these boys were the grandsons of men who had come over here as started living a form of freedom that people had never sensed. Many cases, the British, when they went out to maraud the landscape, they were shocked at how better the living conditions were of these citizens in the countryside. So these fellows, these were young men, were proud of what they had done. They had been sitting around breakfast tables, listening to talk about this life and how much better it was and how much freedom they had. Meanwhile, you had British soldiers and tax agents coming into the houses, taking things in different places, and those stories got around. So my hat's off to these young men. They held the ground. I mean, think in terms, you know, when we send armies in, we are the big power. Think what it was like to be just a farm boy looking at all of this, and then looking at the fellow next to you and saying, we're going to do this. I mean, I'm really proud of them.
Yeah. And you know, this is probably the only place in the British Empire where a person could actually start out and then make something of themselves. They could be a landowner and actually advance. In the old country of England and in other places of the British Empire, there was this class system where you had the aristocrats and then you had all the other people, and they couldn't break through to be into the upper ranks. It was just remarkable that what they had done over here, and they wanted to fight for that opportunity.
One of the interesting things, knowing, you know, we talked about why maybe they would have fought. Statistics are interesting. Some accounts are 29,000, but best accounts there were 19,000 militia there, and of that there was only 11,000 were actually armed. The others had pitchforks and this type thing. Had no training, 13 colonies. They just were arriving days before the battle, weeks after the Declaration of Independence. This is a very short period of time after Declaration of Independence, and they're bringing these people together. I can't imagine the task that General Washington had to organize 11,000 people and put them in front of this huge army.
And not only that, but each colony thought of themselves as a separate nation almost in those days. So they had their own little local prejudices, if you might say, or their own local ideas. And his job was to meld all this into one fighting force. And that was it took a remarkable man in order to do that, I think. We were really fortunate to have George Washington. Then he came down from New England, and then what happened?
Well, let's set the stage. Washington was, this was actually his first battle. He wasn't in New England for the shot heard around the world. He had all of these troops arriving. He was mustering them in what you and I know as New York City. He decided to put his more experienced troops, which happened to be the Maryland and Delaware troops, over in Brooklyn and along a line overlooking the water, because these sharpshooters could take out the officers on any of these passing ships. And had his army split in two locations. He anticipated that the battle would be in the right outside of New York, but onto the Brooklyn area. And then August the 27th, 1776, early in the morning, the battle started. And Hessian soldiers, they were mercenaries for the British, and very, very good soldiers, started attacking exactly where Washington thought they would. And of course the sharpshooters were taking pot shots, and the Hessians were coming up. Unknown to Washington at the time was that the large force of British were coming around on a small path that loyalists, Americans, loyalists had told.
So they were going to try to outflank them, I guess, and surprise them, huh?
That's right. They were going to come around and surprise these rookies, really what they were. And Washington, meanwhile, had moved his base of operation, leaving part of the troops, a small amount in New York City, had moved over to Brooklyn. So he was in an eyesight of what was happening. Then just an hour or two into the battle, the British came around, and all of these farm boys were disorganized, and they were trapped in three sides. Many tried to just put their hands up, and they just were bayoneted by the Hessians. Others were taken away and put in these prison ships, never to be heard of again. The mortality rate was like 98%.
Well, how did Washington allow himself to get so outflanked?
Well, it's interesting, Bruce. Washington was a better general than people think. He actually had 3 or 4 young officers on horseback in this path area, but it was require the British to single file move all of their soldiers up this path, bring their cannon, bring their entire army up, an impossibility. But remember, they were the best army in the world at the time. And these 3 or 4 soldiers saw some other officers and thought they were part of the same group. Didn't realize they were British officers, and it was, they blew it for the day. And the British troops kept coming up there, and then suddenly everyone was overwhelmed by this sudden, massive appearance of this half of the army.
Must have been very frightening to see a whole army where you didn't expect them at all just appear.
As I was reading this, Bruce, periodically I would stop and look at one of those bayonets and think, oh, that would be a very unfriendly thing to meet,
I get the point.
And that's what they were fighting with. So, Bruce, I think, have I set the stage? It's total confusion. It's people trying to surrender, people getting killed. No one really knows what's happening. This entire army, almost a full army, appears. And some of the folks are trying to get back to Washington. And the general in charge of the Delaware and Maryland troops sees what's taking place and takes the soldiers and takes half of them, takes all of them, about 1,200,000 of them, and puts them in place to blockade all that's taking place until they get an assessment of what's happening.
So he really saved the day.
Well, they lost about a couple hundred of them, just trying to figure out what's happening. And then they decided, okay, we're going to take half of them and put them back to protect Washington, and we're going to take half. So that's where we come up with 400.
Oh, okay.
400.
Maryland 400.
400 went back to, and most of those were included the Delaware troops to guard Washington, and the other half went out into the middle to protect, to engage this army. 50-1, the odds. They knew they wouldn't come back, but they just were trying to buy time. And one of the interesting things that takes place is that there's one path only that any of the Americans can get back to safety, and it's about 50, 60 feet wide. They have to come through this path. It's right next to a stone farmhouse. And the British move their cannon into this to the protection of that, because they're still afraid of these American sharpshooters, put the cannon into the farmhouse and point blank range are firing and blasting away on the Americans trying to get, the militia trying to get back. And so these 400 soldiers see what's happening, and they attack that farmhouse 6 times.
Wow.
Think about this. You've got cannon, you've got ships out there firing their cannon, you've got Hessian soldiers firing on them, you've got mortars, you've got 50-to-1 odds, and for 6 charges they went in. The first charge, then they came back. They didn't make it. The second charge, they're losing a man about every 2 minutes. 1 man every 2 minutes.
Wow.
And they kept going, and they kept going. They actually succeeded the 5th charge and held it for a little bit of time, and then they had to go back. We don't know what their ranks were at that point in time. Their bodies were strewn around. And then the final assault, they took it for a short amount of time, and they held it until there was silence. They had all been killed. But they bought the time for Washington and for those men to get back.
Washington was so impressed with the Marylanders and how they formed the line and stood firm that he called them the old line. And that phrase stuck. So Maryland became the old line state.
That's how we got the name.
Yeah, that's how we got the name. It's really amazing.
You know, a fellow named Thomas Field wrote in a few years after the battle that the most precious hour of history was the hour that the Maryland 400 bought for Washington. The most precious hour in the history of freedom was the hour of the Marylanders. And it's something we almost had forgotten in our own history books. An interesting thing has developed. We have the other Marylanders and Delaware militia have regathered to protect Washington. Now, he had other troops there, but they weren't trained like these folks. And so they took the advance. They were out in front of the other troops, showing leadership. Interesting, our Army, the soldiers can be leaders, versus the British needed to have the officers be the leaders. And so we had this happening. During this event, when the men were dying, when falling every 2 minutes, George Washington said, "Good God," he was overheard to say this, "Good God, what fellows I must lose today." Some of these officers he had fought with for 20 years before in the French-Indian War. The General Sterling, in charge of the Maryland-Delaware troops, had fought in the French-Indian War with him. And Sterling had been captured. He had gone out and fought. Major Gist is the hero, as was General Sterling, out there on the field. And of course, he thought he lost Gist, and Gist actually resurfaced. He and 8 others resurfaced, climbed through the mire, and escaped the British and came out. So of the 400, they all were either killed or captured. Very few were heard of again. Not absolutely sure of the names of the people, because they were bodies blown to pieces. But we did get 8 back, and we'll see them over and over and over again for the next years of the war. They'll just be in every major battle, because Washington will depend on them. So you'll hear the name Major Gist, and he's a Marylander. So I'm trying to set the stage here. We have finally this silence, and we have Cornwallis now has gone back to Howe and said, "Hey, these guys are tough, but now we're going to have to attack." And then there was a strange sequence of events. In fact, I think the reason the Maryland 400 story hasn't been told is that the divine intervention that follows. And still, Howe, he thought he had Washington trapped. He still couldn't do anything about it, because he had lost so many of his top officers, because there were still some of these Marylander sharpshooters out there shooting the officer corps.
These sharpshooters of the Continentals, they were up there in the trees picking off the British officers. The British Army relied so heavily on their officers to tell them what to do, they couldn't even do anything if they weren't there. And they were so good at picking off these officers that the British officers were actually hiding. You know, anytime they got something going, it was because there was a British officer there that was doing it. Then he'd get picked off, and then it would fail. And it went on like that. And it so impressed them that actually the British had to go out and take care of these sharpshooters, or snipers, if you will. And when they did finally kill them, they refused to even bury them because they were so angry at them for what they were able to do, destroy their mobility and their leadership.
Another interesting piece, I think, from this, I was telling you about the farmhouse. Well, the British officer in charge of the cannon was a fellow named Cornwallis that we'll hear about later in the war. And he's the one that went out and was taking that. And if you read some of these letters that these British soldiers wrote back, they talked about these Maryland boys like, boy, I mean, they all died. What a shame, because they were really great soldiers. But what's interesting is Cornwallis knew what the Continentals had in them. He knew firsthand, going out there and watching 50-to-1 odds and watching these fellows continue to attack. I mean, it's just an amazing story.
And for the first time, it probably dawned on them that, hey, this is not going to be as easy as we thought, is it?
And where those fellows fell is where the Statue of Liberty looks. So that's how important it was 100 years later. We said that earlier, but I can't get over that.
At least twice during these battles, the fog came in so that they were able to the Americans were able to retreat over the East River, and that fog didn't dissipate until later in the day, and then later the fog came in again when they also retreated across the Hudson. And a lot of them, including George Washington, contribute that to divine intervention.
Well, one other thing is the river, the East River. They could have easily sent their ships up the East River and just decimated Washington.
Right.
But the winds never allowed the ships to go up there until Washington's army had gone over. After the fog, which didn't lift till 10 in the morning, and Washington was the last man to step out of the fog. But after that happened, they could go up the river. And Washington had regrouped and taken the smatterings of his army back into Manhattan. But of course, you know, you hear a lot of people say, well, Washington never won a battle. Well, you know, it's sort of true when you've got 1 to 3 odds, untrained people. So Washington was on the run. He gets in Manhattan. He continues to go up the island. He can't go too far because there's Fort Washington, and Fort Washington's where his cannons and a lot of his ammunition are stored. So he needs to get his troops there. And this is where the Maryland, and we'll see this over and over again in the Delaware troops, he always has to have a rear guard as he moves his army. And it's the Maryland troops and these sharpshooters take him back. They're very disciplined, and they let the army get, and then they fade and take another rear position.
He really had learned that he could rely on them.
He did. And then Fort Washington, again, he took his sharpshooters and put them out there. Hal took half of his army to attack Fort Washington, and you had these sharpshooters up there taking out their officers. And something like 200 and 300 of them died. The Marylanders took heavy casualties during all of this, but they continued to provide Washington, you know, what he needed. And then for the next months, there's a series of engagements where Washington hits and then, you know, has to leave. So the Battle of Fort Washington, Bruce, is considered a loss for Washington because he had some key items, you know, cannon there. But again, I think the British saw how tenacious these militia were, and again, it's our ancestors right here on the Eastern Shore in many of these battles. I mean, I think you were telling me you knew about this Robert Kirkwood.
Yeah, he was a gentleman from the upper part of Delaware, and he fought in every battle of the Revolutionary War. Actually, there's a highway named for him up there between
really?
Newark, Delaware, and Wilmington, Delaware. Very well known in Delaware.
That was 33 battles, I believe. It went for 7 years.
Yeah.
You know, he said to his wife, "Hey, listen, wife, I got to go away for almost a decade and fight the biggest army in the world."
Right.
Think he had that conversation? I don't know.
I don't know. I know she didn't have a dishwasher.
A couple other fellows came from Milford. Milford actually was part of Maryland until the year before the Revolutionary War, and then became that. And it was John Hazlitt and John Hazard. And actually, all the folks watching today have actually seen John Hazard's picture in multiple photographs and never really realized it. His commander was John Hazlitt, and Hazard was maybe related. I'm not absolutely sure of that. And they fought there.
It really brings it to life because I have a cousin that lives in Denver, and his wife is a direct descendant of John Hazlitt.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. And then we come down here to Eastern Shore. We have Samuel Handy of Pemberton over here, and Henry Dennis. Now, they had a little different role in the battle. They were related to the water. They had ships. They took supplies to our troops. They raided British ships and took supplies off of them and sent those supplies up there. The British did not like their activities. And but they very, very important. You know, a lot of people think of the Eastern Shore's role as being the breadbasket of the Revolutionary War, and they really overlook some of these great, brave men that came from here that fought in the battle. And we mentioned John Gumby, earlier.
Right.
I think the fellow that I enjoy the most, he's actually a Virginian because he's out of Accomack, is John Cropper.
Right.
John Cropper, again, was one of these generals that fought in all the battles, saved a lot of men with a bayonet in his leg. Well, we might talk about that in a few minutes. But he lived down right in Accomack, and he went home to visit his wife. There's a lot of letters over in Ab Center where he's writing his wife during the war. But he goes down, and a loyalist tells the British that he's there. And so British Marines sneak up in the river and come up to his house and capture him and his wife, tie them up, and start going through the house. They plan to burn the house or taking any silver, any coins that they can find. But they stop in the wine cellar, and they spend a little too much time in the wine cellar. And while they're in the wine cellar, Cropper is on the second floor tied up, releases himself, gets out, runs 3 miles to a neighbor's place and says, "Neighbor, I got British Marines, at my place. Come help me." And the neighbor said, "Oh, I don't know, I'm busy tonight, but I got some muskets you can use." And so Cropper took 3 muskets back. He's got these Marine soldiers, the best soldiers around. He sets the muskets up and fires them. He's thinking about this, I guess, as he runs back. Bang, bang, bang. 3 muskets go off, and he yells, "We got them surrounded, boys. Let's get them." And these guys down in the cellar go, "Oh my gosh, we're surrounded." And they go running out. They get in the boat. They take off and go to back to their ship. And he releases his wife and gets out of it. I mean, I love the story because it says so much about the kind of folks that we had there.
Another example of the independent streak of the American soldier. I love it.
So Washington has to make a big decision right before it's Christmas Eve. It's right before.
Yeah, his army's melting away.
Yeah.
Here they are, and the winter's getting ready to set in, and
They all had enlistment periods that are going to stop in a few days. So he had to make a decision. So he decided to attack Trenton, and it was a Hessian stronghold there, and the river was filled with blocks of ice. So he needed a good Eastern Shoreman, waterman, to get across. And John Hazard's who he selected. He asked Hazard to take his little boat across, over and back, and that's what Hazard's role was in this. And
he's pictured, isn't he, in the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware?
He is in the back, just working like trying to get steer through through the ice. So the folks here should be really proud of that. And then there's another important battle that comes up. It's called Brandywine. Again, the Marylanders and the Delaware folks get called to action because Brandywine is an action to stop the the British from attacking the founders in Philadelphia. So again, they're trying to buy time. They know they're going to lose. They lose almost 1,000 men. They're trying to buy time so the army can escape. Not the army, delay the British army so the founders can get away, which they did. Brandywine's actually where Cropper actually saves a lot of his men with a bayonet through his leg. He never slows down until he saves his whole contingent. They were Virginia militia, and that was followed by the Battle of Monmouth, and that's where Hazlitt died. And Hazlitt was so important to. We mentioned Hazlitt was from Milford. He was so important to Washington that Washington came over to view his body, and was visibly emotional about this. So he depended greatly on these men from the Eastern Shore. We were more than the breadbasket.
And you know, Vaughn, one of the things that's sometimes overlooked is everybody talks about, oh, Washington never won a battle and so forth. One of the things they don't really study or they don't think about is the fact that he was able to hold the army together. And it was the importance of the battle at Trenton where they crossed the Delaware on Christmas Day and everything. He finally had a victory, and he was able to encourage a lot of the people to become recruits again. Some of the ones he was able to convince to stay on, that were going to go home, and able to get new recruits. Take Maryland, for example. They started with 3,900, and then by November of 1776 they had 821, and it was down by December to 770. So they were losing a lot in the battles, and they were such an inspiration that they were actually helping in the recruitment.
Yeah, the Maryland 400 story was told at every breakfast table and dinner table around the colonies, and that really helped inspire a lot of the young men to come back and to fight. Mm-hmm. And had it not been for that, we talk about the hour, but think about the inspiration of the troops that Washington needed to continue fighting this army.
And really, it's something that could have gone horribly the other way if they hadn't have done what they did.
Yeah, I just can't imagine what he went through. But one of the funnier things, as I was going through the records over here at NAB, knowing that they were trying to recruit, I discovered one company where the captain was Josiah Dale, and I started looking at the people in the unit, and Campbell Dale was there, and Ebenezer Dale, and Jacob Dale, and Jesse Dale, and John Dale, and John P. Dale, and John Dale, and the son of John Dale, and his cousin Archibald Baker, George Baker, Levin Baker, Salatho Baker, Zadok Baker. And I started thinking, my gosh, that must have been a heck of a Thanksgiving dinner they had. And I think there was probably some military efficiency to that, because Josiah Dale, Captain Josiah Dale, just had to say, Dale and Baker, take that hill.
You know, I've been to Valley Forge, and one of the things that really impressed me was the conditions that those fellows lived under for that winter. Man, half of them were starving. They had little huts. They had lack of clothing. Washington was always fighting with Congress in order to try to supply his troops more. Most of them were barefoot, and a lot of them died from disease.
And one of the things that I noticed reading the letters was frostbite. It's something I never realized, because you said they had very little clothes. Frostbite and amputations was a big part of the problem. But he went in with 11,000, and 2,500 died.
They were halfway through the winter. They were halfway through the winter before every one of them had any kind of shelter at all. You know, one of the good things about Valley Forge was it did give them some time to have some training. And they had training, and then George Washington sat down and figured out what to do. He discovered that he would never win a battle coming up against the British head-to-head. But he could go out and have a hit-and-run type of strategy where he would hit them hard and then disappear and melt into the scenery. And that allowed him to prolong the war and also to keep his men on the battlefield.
And that takes us into the Southern campaign, where that strategy he effectively begins to use. the Battle of Camden in South Carolina was actually considered a victory for the British, but Marylanders took a big hit there. Between Maryland and Delaware, they lost so many men. That's when they formed one company. But they actually hit them, and then they delayed the retreat. And delayed the retreat intentionally so to draw the British out. And they dragged the British halfway across North Carolina, from South Carolina to North Carolina. And that's when the British started realizing that they might have a problem winning this war. It was a win, but it was significant because they started realizing this might not work. And one of the participants of that was our Governor Levin Winder. He was wounded badly, and that becomes important for the War of 1812 because he's indoctrinated to what war is like as a young man. And then there's a second battle. You might want to talk about the Battle of Cowpens that followed the Camden.
Picking up on the strategy that they actually had the militia form up in front of the British, and then they allowed the British to attack them, and it looked like they were in retreat, the Americans, and they ran back to some fixed positions that they had already set up, and they actually trapped the British. And the interesting thing about that battle is depicted in the movie The Patriot. A lot of the techniques and everything were shown in that movie. Most people can remember that.
A little more insight into that. Guess who two of the major players are? Major Gist, who we met. He's no longer a major. We met him up in New York. And John Gumby, right down here on the Lower Eastern Shore.
Right.
Gumby has actually led the retreat, turn, re-attack. And not only did he re-attack, he attacked Britain's finest unit. And so this is a new strategy. And they're now keeping the British off guard.
I can just see them now, the British. Boys, we got them on the run now. And then all of a sudden, they stop and turn, and then they realize that, hey, we don't have them on the run.
We're really just hitting a lot of, there's a lot of, I wish people would go over to NAB. There's a whole section over there of books that are wonderful that they can dig into it. But let's get to Yorktown. Our guys were at Yorktown. The British were at Yorktown. And the reason they were there is this Southern campaign was really starting to wear them thin. And they went there because they were going to have support. Their ships would come in and pick them up. And the French came to our aid to help. And it became a battle of dropping cannon. Cannon just dropping shells and on Cornwallis. And Cornwallis had already had his taste of the Marylanders up in New York. But there was some military engagements there, and Washington was really clever of who he chose to do that. There were two redoubts. A redoubt is a fortified area down in Yorktown. One, he allowed the French soldiers to go in. They went in by bayonet at night and overtook this. That bayonet is steel that long. And the other redoubt was taken by the militia out of Rhode Island. They were mostly black troops. You don't hear that too much in history. And these guys were fighting for their freedom, and he allowed them to go in. And then the rest of that kind of campaign, they watched these guys. They were all very valiant the way they fought.
So, Cornwallis there at Yorktown, he must have been getting very frustrated because the French were keeping the British fleet out, and he was waiting on the fleet to help him to escape. And here he was. He saw the futility of it. He recognized the fortitude of the Maryland 400 years before in New York when he saw them charge 6 times against his position. And now here he is, a proud British general having to surrender to these rebels. And actually, when they did surrender, they came out playing the song, "The World Turned Upside Down." So that must have been very humiliating for him.
Well, I think that if I had a chance to go to any place back in time in history, I'd like to be at that surrender site and see those British soldiers marching in between lines of these militia who have just been fighting for years, and they've lost so many friends. They had to be thinking about all the friends that they lost, and watching this take place, and watch these proud, arrogant soldiers, at least the officers. I think the British soldiers, rank and file, were probably fine. Watch them take their weapons and deposit their weapons and march back. And I believe Washington refused to take Cornwallis's sword. He honored him as more so than he would have been honored. Had it been the other way around, I think George Washington would have been hanging from Howe's flagstaff in front of, to be viewed in front of everyone. So it had to be a wonderful moment, and it's wonderful for us because that moment set the stage for what we have today.
So, Vaughn, when you think about what you said earlier about people making a difference, you stop and think about what those Maryland 400 guys did back in Brooklyn. They gained that extra hour for George Washington and everything. It's important for people to remember that those guys on that battlefield did make a difference. We can make a difference. When you stop and think about all the advancements that we've had in the United States and America and everything, in science and our culture and our freedoms and so forth, advancements for mankind all over the world, it's important for us to remember that we can make a difference.